Welcome everyone to today's CUGR talk on how to write an effective abstract. And I hope this will provide you with some information that you may need to write an abstract for the upcoming UMaine Student Symposium. Just a couple of housekeeping rules before we get started. It would be preferable if you can keep your microphones muted throughout today's CUGR talk. Unless you would like to ask a question, then please feel free to come off mute and ask a question. You also can use the raise hand function, and you can post a question in chat. If you have any questions at any time, I'd be happy to answer them. I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen. And I think that you all know this, but this is being recorded. I hope that doesn't prevent you from asking any questions that you may have. So for those of you that I haven't had the opportunity to meet, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Melissa McGinnis. I am an associate professor in the Department of Molecular and Biomedical Sciences. And in that role, I do research, I teach, and I advise students. I serve as a research mentor to both undergraduate and graduate students in the laboratory. And throughout my career as a researcher, through my PhD and my postdoc, and now as a research advisor, I have written many abstracts, and I have helped my students to write many abstracts. So in total, I have co-authored over 150 abstracts. And the majority of them, I am the first author or the senior author on them. So I've had a major role in writing and editing them and getting them ready for submission. And so I'm happy that I can share all of this experience with you today so that you can write an effective abstract for the upcoming student symposium and maybe for other conferences or other purposes that you have coming up. In addition, I'm also the Associate Director of the Center for Undergraduate Research, CUGR, and in that role, I've been helping to plan our UMaine Student Symposia for the past few years. And we're looking forward to this year's upcoming Student Symposium, which will be a hybrid event, and I will tell you a little bit more about that in today's CUGR talk. So just an outline for what I'm going to do today. First, I'll give a little bit of background on what an abstract is. And then I'm going to give you some tips and a recipe for writing an effective abstract. And then we have a little activity where we will go into breakout rooms to have you work on putting an abstract together in the correct order. It's called a jigsaw activity. And then I'm going to give you a plan for writing your abstract and provide you with a timeline for the upcoming student symposium, and then I'll have time for questions. So at any time, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat and I can try to get to it at that point. If you have something that you really would like clarification on, please feel free to speak up or raise your hand at any time. So just starting off, what is an abstract? An abstract is essentially the introduction or summary to a manuscript, a proposal, or to a presentation. So there are different types of abstracts. So for instance, for a proposal or a manuscript that you may be submitting, you have an abstract that serves as the introduction, providing a summary. And this is like a first impression. And I like to think of this as the book jacket cover or maybe a trailer to a movie. And you want to inform the reader that this is interesting and that they should keep reading. So back in the day when we used to go to bookstores, we actually used to read the book jacket cover to see if we wanted to buy a book, if that was a book that we wanted to read. Now we probably look at the summary on Amazon and maybe look at some of the reviews and the stars. So there are different ways, but this is really the introduction. And you want to grab the attention of the reader and let them know that they want to read more. So this is really your first impression. You're providing them with a review or a project summary. So you may see this if you're looking at manuscripts or perhaps a proposal or maybe even your honors thesis or a capstone paper that you might be writing, okay? So that's one type of abstract. Another type of abstract is a conference abstract. And this is what you submit when you would like to present at a conference or a symposium. And this is informing the selection committee of potential presentations. And this is really important because you want them to know that you're presenting something that's really interesting. And it also can sometimes provide them with some information so that they can determine who should be giving an oral presentation over a poster presentation. For the UMaine Student Symposium, we accept all abstracts that are approved by an advisor. And so once it has been approved by an advisor, then every student is welcome to upload a presentation, and every student is welcome to present a poster in person. However, for other conferences, this may also influence certain things like selection for awards, like a travel award. And ultimately, once you write and submit your abstract, then it gets published in a book of abstracts. And for the Student Symposium, an example of our book of abstracts is shown up here on the top from the 2021 Student Symposium. And then in the bottom, this is a book of abstract for the conference that I attend on an annual basis, which is the American Society for Virology Conference, because I'm a virologist. So how do we go about writing an effective conference abstract? So first thing is, it has to be easily read by the target audience. And this is the #1 rule in all of writing and all of presenting: know your audience. Who are you writing this for? You want to make sure that everyone can easily understand the information that you are putting into the abstract. And so sometimes that could be different. Perhaps if I'm submitting an abstract to American Society for Virology, where all virologists will be reading it, I can provide a little more technical information. When I'm submitting to the Humane Student Symposium, where we have people from all disciplines, I would write it in a broader way so that it is accessible to a broad audience. So for example, we can have people coming from molecular and biomedical sciences, from engineering, but also from education, arts, music, humanities. So we want to keep that in mind, that we have people coming from many different disciplines. And if they are looking at the book of abstracts to determine which presentations they would like to view, or which posters they would like to visit on the day of the event, you want to make it accessible to everyone reading it so that they're interested and want to learn more, want to visit your poster or view your presentation online. The second rule is that you have to follow the specific formatting instructions. So all abstracts have specific instructions. Usually there is a word limit. So for instance, for a student symposium, it's 250 words. Now that's the maximum number of words. You can have less words, but you have to use the appropriate number of words to make sure that you are conveying the message. You can't just simply have one sentence that says like, the results of these experiments will be discussed. You have to provide some information, and I'm going to tell you what that information is, okay? But usually the hardest part is trying to get it under 250 words. So when you're writing it, you want to think about writing it in a way that's clear and concise, and it's a standalone document, okay? Because your presentation doesn't really go with the abstract in the beginning, and your presentation is not available perhaps until the day of the event. So it's going to stand alone, and you need to have all the information there so that people can understand what they're reading. This is your opportunity to really sell your research and get people excited about your research. In this abstract, you also want to make sure that you are avoiding any technical jargon. So you don't want to get bogged down in technical jargon, because then it won't be accessible to a broad audience anymore. You also have to make sure that you define any necessary terms, and you want to make sure that you are keeping track of the number of words, because every single word counts. And then you want to go through and cut any unnecessary words. The best way to write a good abstract is to make sure that you get edits and feedback from people, at least 2 to 3 people. So generally you're going to get feedback from your advisor, but you also can get feedback from another person in your lab or on your research team, maybe from a classmate, a roommate, but you want to make sure that you're getting feedback from lots of different people so that they can read it from their perspective and provide you with some feedback to improve your abstract. So here's the recipe for writing an effective conference abstract. The first thing is your title. And the title should not be overlooked, because as I'm saying that people are going to read your abstract first to determine if they want to read more or go to your presentation, they're actually going to read the title first, just like you would read the title of a book first to determine if you're interested in reading it. So you want to have a good title that is going to capture the attention of your audience. You want to make sure that your title doesn't have too much technical jargon. You want to make sure that it's catchy, but not too catchy. You also want to keep it professional. And so spend some time on the title. Usually we come up with a couple of titles, a couple of options, and then as we're sending it out to have people edit and provide feedback, we say, can you provide some feedback on the titles as well? So that's a good way to get some input from your editors. And then the abstract itself. So the first 1 to 3 sentences is the introduction. And this is the place where you're introducing the topic and providing any necessary background that your reader needs in order to understand your abstract. Then the next 1 to 2 sentences is stating the challenge or the problem. So you want to have a very clear statement of the overall problem, project, or question that your research is actually seeking to answer. So how does your project seek to solve this problem? What's your hypothesis or your goal? You want to make sure that that is really clearly stated, because then someone knows what your presentation is all about. And then the meat of your abstract are the results. So this is where you're going to describe the findings, and you want to give some mention to the methods that were utilized. You don't have to give too much detail here, but you want to provide enough specific information so that you convey the impact of your research. And this portion is about 4 to 6 sentences. And then you move on to the conclusions. And in the conclusions, this is really your summary of the key findings, but also you want to state how this relates to the big picture impact. So I like to think of this as drawing a circle from the statement of the problem to the statement at the end where you provide the big picture impact of your work. If the reader is going through the abstract and they see that, okay, you're going to solve this problem, and then you get to the end and you don't really say how you're solving the problem, then they're going to feel a little unsatisfied or disappointed. And I realize that research is a work in progress, and you have to present your research in whatever form you have it at the time of the submission of the abstract. But you're making progress. So you can state what that progress is towards answering the big picture question. Okay, and I think we had a question. Mindy, did you catch who had a hand raised?
Zachary Doherty.
Okay.
There's also a question in the chat, Melissa.
Okay. So Zachary, do you want to ask your question?
No, I'm all set. You've answered it.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then a question in the chat. Is there any limit for abbreviations in the abstract? There's not really a limit to the number of abbreviations. What's really important is to make sure that you have defined all abbreviations. And sometimes in research, there can be so many abbreviations, like especially in molecular biology, it can turn into a bit of an alphabet soup. And I have gotten that feedback before when I've written an abstract and given it to someone to read, and they say, this is a little bit alphabet soupy. So you need to clean up all of the acronyms that you're using and try to avoid using so many acronyms. So you can think of another way to say it if you have a ton of abbreviations in your abstract. So just keep that in mind, that for the reader, when they're going through and reading something and there are a ton of acronyms, they're really familiar to you. So you might not catch it when you're reading it, but when someone else reads it, they may stumble when they're reading over so many acronyms because it's just not very natural to them. Okay, any other questions before we move on to the activity? Okay, so I have an activity for us to work on. And in this time, we could, after I announce the activity, we can stop the recording. But in this activity, what we're going to do is a jigsaw puzzle, essentially, okay? And I have taken an abstract that I have written before for a conference. I've modified it slightly, and I have reordered the sentences. And what I'm asking you to do is to put them in the correct order using the recipe that I have provided. So I want you to find the introduction, the statement of the problem. I want you to find the results, and then the conclusion and big picture statement, and put it into the order by using the numbers for the sentences that are in a Google Doc that will be shared in the chat if it's not there yet. And then just tell me the order that the sentences should be placed in for an effective abstract. So we're going to go into breakout rooms now, and I'll stop my share. And okay, welcome back, everyone. I think Mindy's also going to put a question into the poll for you. We just want to get a sense as to how many people have written an abstract before. Okay, awesome. So the majority of people have written an abstract before. That's great. And for those of you that are writing one for the first time, hopefully this is a good exercise to get you rolling on writing your first abstract. Now, I'd like to talk about the jigsaw activity. And the best way I think to do that with this size of a group is for me to just ask you for the order of sentences. And I'm just going to call out like, what was the first sentence? And I'm going to ask you to put it into the chat, and then we can have discussion. It's totally okay if you don't get it perfectly correct the first time. Okay, so what was the first sentence? Which number? Okay, I'm seeing 3s and 4s. Mostly 3s. So the answer is 3. 3 was the first sentence. And then second sentence. Some 7s and 4s. The correct answer is 7. And then the next sentence, the third sentence. So it goes 4 and then 1. Okay. And then the next sentence in the jigsaw activity, 8, and then 5. Okay. And then after 5, 2. That's right. And then next, 9, and then 6. Right. Great. So you got it really close. And in some cases, you got it perfect. And I realize that for some of you, you may be reading something that's totally outside of your field. So that may have provided some additional challenge. But it also may mean that I need to write a better abstract. So perhaps you're giving me a little bit of feedback that I could do a better job making sure that I'm also following the recipe. So I'm going to actually show you what this abstract looks like. So this is an abstract that I wrote for a conference, and then I modified it slightly for this activity. And the title of this abstract is Serotonin Receptors Facilitate Cellular Invasion by JC Polyomavirus. Now that may sound very technical, but I was presenting this at a Novel Concepts in Virology meeting that was being held in Barcelona. So this was an international meeting with people that are experts in the field of virology. So I didn't have to keep it very broad and basic for this group. That's a group that wants to know really exactly what you're talking about, because every presentation there is about viruses. So they want to know which virus you're presenting on, what is your area of expertise, which is mine is virus host cell interactions. So this provides them with a little more detail on what I would be presenting. So it's really important that I provide some technical information in the title, but it's not too bogged down with technical jargon. And then you'll see that I have the list of authors here. So my name is underlined because I was the presenting author. And then these are the co-authors on the abstract, including Dr. Sam Hess in the Department of Physics. And then you'll see these little numbers, those are our affiliations. So usually when you're submitting an abstract, especially for something outside of the University of Maine, they're going to ask for your affiliations. The University of Maine, everyone's going to be affiliated with UMaine or UMaine Machias. But when you're presenting at something that's statewide or regional or national, then you provide your affiliations by listing your department and also listing the university. So you can see mine here is Department of Molecular and Biomedical Sciences, and I'm also a faculty member in our GSBSE program. And then Dr. Hess is in the Department of Physics. And then we have the University of Maine. And then my email is listed there because I am the corresponding author for this abstract. So generally they'll ask for someone that could be the corresponding author. That's the person that's going to communicate with the conference planning committee. And then you'll see that this is the final version of the abstract listed here. So the next step is for you to get started with writing your abstract. Okay, so what's the best way to do this? The first thing to do is to find out the deadline and put it on your calendar, okay? So the deadline for abstract submission for the UMaine Student Symposium is March 7th. So now that you know the deadline, you can put it on your calendar, and you should actually put down the time that the abstracts are due so that you make sure you get it submitted on time on the correct day. And then once you know the deadline, then you want to make a timeline for yourself and work backwards from that so that you have a timeline for successful completion and submission of your abstract, okay? And what you should not do is this, okay? So this is just sort of like a funny timeline, but this is actually what people do a lot of the times. They think like, oh, you know, it's just a little abstract. It's generally about 5 to 10 sentences. So this will be way, way easy. It's only 250 words. I have plenty of time. And then it's a month to the deadline and they're like, I'll do it later. And then next thing you know, after a while, you keep procrastinating and procrastinating, and then you're scrambling to get it done on the day that it's due. And then you hustle and you get it submitted. And then oftentimes once it's submitted, the conference planners will say, due to overwhelming interest, we have extended the submission deadline. And so that happens. And then you realize that you had a little more time. But I don't want you to follow this silly deadline. I want you to follow a deadline that will allow you to write an effective abstract and successfully submit the abstract, and something that you can be really proud of. Okay, so put the deadline on your calendar and then work backwards from that. So perhaps you want to talk with your research advisor and say, I'm planning to submit to the student symposium and the abstracts are due on March 7th. And when would you like to see it so that you can have time to provide me with edits and feedback? And I usually tell my students that I need it a week in advance of the deadline. And that's because if I am reviewing abstracts for approximately 10 students on my laboratory team, I want to make sure I have enough time to provide edits to all of them. And there's generally some back and forth. So there's generally a couple of rounds of revisions until they get to the finalized abstract that's ready for submission. So you want to allow for that time, okay? So maybe your advisor needs it a week before the deadline. And then maybe you want to give it to a classmate or another person on your research team. So you want to make an internal deadline for yourself to submit it to them and give yourself a couple of days to incorporate their revisions. And you want to maybe also put an internal deadline for yourself on the calendar. When would you like to have your first draft ready? So those are some things that you can think of. Just kind of put that deadline on your calendar and start working backwards from there, rather than procrastinating until the last minute. Because at the end of the day, if this is really 5 to 10 sentences, if you started writing it now, it's writing about 2 sentences per week in order to get it done, okay, to get it submitted on time. So you could do that, or one day when you just feel like writing it, you just sit down and, you know, when you have that motivation, just write it, just get it written. And if you want to think about the recipe as you're writing, you could say, I'm going to break it down into bits, because sometimes even though it's only 250 words, it feels a little overwhelming to write it. So you can say, I'm just going to work on the introduction today, because the introduction is not going to change very much, even if your results might still be coming in. So you can write the intro. That's just 1 to 3 sentences, okay? Or you can think about writing your sentence to state the challenge or the problem, okay? So when something feels overwhelming, break it down into bits so that it feels like something that you can manage. The other thing that you want to do to get started is to review the formatting instructions. And if we could post the UMaine Student Symposium website into the chat too, then you can take a look at the formatting instructions. So we ask students to submit an abstract that's 250 words or approximately 1,500 characters. And we ask that you describe the focus, method, or process and the outcome of your project, following discipline or program-specific standards as advised by faculty mentors. But I want you to also keep in mind that this should be broadly accessible across disciplines. okay? So you take a look and you see that the abstract's 250 words. You already know what you're working with, okay? And keep that in mind as you're writing the abstract so that you don't get a surprise when you go to submit it and the form says 250 words and then you realize, I need to cut all these words. Okay, so then just use the formula that I provided and get started. And you want to make sure that you're getting feedback from a peer, a colleague, your advisor, and really spend time editing, revising, and perfecting your abstract. This is a really important document, so you really want to put a lot of effort into it. If you're still having a hard time, I think it's helpful to tell someone about your research and then let them help you with the wording. So oftentimes when we explain something to someone, it may come across in a way that's easier for them to digest than it is if you're trying to type it. And so sometimes if you are working with someone and they're providing feedback, they may say like, what are you actually trying to say here? And then when you say it, they respond with, oh, okay, that sounds so much better than what you actually wrote. You should write it like that. So that's why it's a good piece of advice to just sit with someone when they're providing you with the feedback so that you can go over it with them and you might be able to explain it to them in a way that helps you perfect the writing. If you go through all of this and you're still feeling unsure about where to start, we have a lot of excellent resources that can help you. And the best way to learn how to write and to write technically in your research field is to read. And whether that may be reading papers or reading abstracts, you could go to our UMaine Student Symposium website and look at the archives. And you can use these archives as examples. So you could go to the category that aligns with your discipline. So I would go to biomedical sciences, and I could read through abstracts that are in my category to provide me with some guidance and just some additional examples. And I think it's really helpful to read through a few examples to see how you should write an abstract if you haven't done it before. Another thing that you could do is if you're working with a research team, you could say, would you mind sending me your latest abstract so that I could take a look at how you wrote it? And usually people are very happy to share this with you. So that would be the best approach, is using all of your resources available